Good morning, YouTube. Just getting ready for the start of The Outsiders. Sunday the 2nd of July. And of course it's not The Outsiders anymore, is it? It's that Tom Switzer and it's round table discussion.
Here and overseas suffered another ransomware attack, although not as extensive as the previous WannaCry attack. Meanwhile, a new Australian cyber warfare unit that's being built up over coming years. That's to defend against cyber attacks on our military, as well as having the ability to launch its own cyber attacks on foreign military and criminal forces. But of more immediate concern to the government is how to counter the use of internet services by these jihadists, especially the use of encrypted messaging apps such as WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook Messenger, all of that. Now, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull will take this issue to the G20 in Hamburg, Germany later this week. And it was a focus of the Five Eyes meeting in Canada last week. Now, that's the meeting of the five intelligence sharing partners, Australia, the US, Canada, New Zealand and Britain. The Prime Minister, Theresa May, following the recent terror attacks in the UK, she called for an international agreement to regulate the internet.
We cannot allow this ideology the safe space it needs to breed. Yet that is precisely what the internet and the big companies that provide internet-based services provide. We need to work with allied democratic governments to reach international agreements that regulate cyberspace to prevent the spread of extremist and terrorism planning.
That's Theresa May. Now, the use of encrypted communications, that's essential for privacy and security. We all use encrypted services, for banking and other businesses, as well as private personal conversations. So finding a way to disrupt criminal activities without affecting all of us, that surely will be especially difficult. Now, the big social media platforms face growing pressure to rein in extremist content. Last Monday, we had Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Microsoft. They announced a global internet forum to counter terrorism. So the question we're asking this morning is, can law enforcement disrupt terrorists on the internet without hitting the rest of us? Here are my guests. Jacinta Carroll is Head of Counter-Terrorism Policy at ASPI. That's the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Welcome back to the program, Jacinta.
Oh, good morning, Tom. Very good to be with you.
Nigel Fair is Director at the Centre for Internet Safety at the University of Canberra. Nigel's a former Detective Superintendent with the Australian Federal Police. That's where he headed up high-tech crime investigations. G'day, Nigel.
G'day, Tom.
And John Lawrence is Executive Officer with the digital rights advocacy group Electronic Frontiers Australia. Good morning to you, John.
G'day, Tom.
Jacinta, let's start with you. Could you just outline the size of the problem in terms of how extensively terrorists are using these encrypted messaging services to plan and carry out attacks?
Well, the first thing to say is that terrorists, as you alluded to, use this just the way all of us do. So it's freely available. There's a high uptake, particularly in first world Western countries like Australia, of smartphone technology. And we can get anything, you or I, any listeners right now can download something like WhatsApp or Telegram. WhatsApp, famously, of course, is a completely free service currently. And so terrorists have been using these things that were developed to make our lives better. And they've certainly been implicated using encrypted communications in most of the major attacks that we've witnessed in Europe in the last 2 years. Very famously, the major attacks in Paris in November 2015 had a significant level of use of encrypted communications to recruit, to plan, and to have, in that case, of course, IS in the Middle East being able to speak directly to its members in France and in Brussels in planning it. And that's something that's invisible to authorities. So it doesn't have the easy signatures, or if you've got a signature, an easy mechanism to be able to drill in and see what the content of those communications are. And this is a change. This is a very different thing from the old wires and poles, copper-based technology where it was possible to intercept.
Well, John, this encryption technology is awfully complicated for ordinary people who don't follow this debate closely. I mean, are there different levels of encryption used? So is the encryption used by, say, Facebook Messenger different from that used by, say, when you do your bank for the internet banking transactions or for secure shopping online?
Well, in a sense, yes, but the fundamental technology is the same. And let's be clear, encryption wasn't invented with the internet. I mean, Jacinta's right that we are in a different paradigm here, but even in a world of sort of pre-telephone, encryption was being used by people trying to communicate secretly, whether that was just a code book. Clearly, the whole use of the Enigma system during the Second World War by the Germans, and of course everyone else was doing it as well. So encryption is not necessarily kind of an internet-based technology issue, and in a sense, even if even if there was a way to intercept these sorts of, or to break the encryption on these end-to-end encryption services, that doesn't mean that people won't start, using encryption in terms of actual code words and various other ways to elude things. So I think it's important here not to focus too much on the technology itself, because I think we're dealing with some much wider issues.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, Nigel, you of course, as I mentioned before, the detective superintendent with the AFP. I mean, what tools do the federal police and other law enforcement agencies currently have to intercept these jihadists and other criminal communications online?
Well, all policing agencies and national security agencies have quite a wide range of tools available to them. So firstly, at the lower end of the scale, they've got metadata, and metadata is so incredibly rich. It's really quite easy to get hold of, provides an awful lot of information, and is really valuable in any criminal / national security investigation. Then as you start going up the tree, we get all the way up to getting content from devices, whatever that device might be, a landline, mobile device, etc. And there's rules around that, how they get access to it, going through an AA team member to get approval, all these sorts of things, a lot of rigmarole around it and a lot of rigor, which is really important because content, when you're eavesdropping on someone's content, it really is one of the most, dare I say, privacy infringing, for want of a better word, things that you can do. So that's really appropriate. And there's a whole lot of things in between. But I'm just going to pick up on John's point. It's really important. I also agree not to pick on the technology here, because we've got a lot of public policy issues around all this, let alone before we get into the technology issues.
Yeah, what about that, just staying with you, Nigel, the so-called backdoor option to allow them to use software to override the encryption? What are the implications of that?
Well, firstly, you've got technology implications. It's just not that easy when you've got really strong or even medium strong encryption to create backdoors. That's the first thing. It's just not a stroke of a pen or writing another couple of lines of code or anything like that. And remember, call it 4 years ago when the Arab Spring was about, we were saying how great this is for democracy. That dissidents around the place can get their messaging out there, and it's great. So we sort of flipped that on its head now all of a sudden. So we've got to remember that. And of course, our Prime Minister has said he often uses these chat channels to talk to his cabinet colleagues, and that's great. So I think we've got to be wary about just saying, well, we should have a back door, or in some cases people talking about a front door, this warrant-based approach where you go to the organisation behind the application and get access that way. So technically it's not that easy, as great as it would be, and I get it why it would be. But of course, these criminals are sometimes quite smart people, and you can go to WhatsApp and some of the more mainstream ones, and they might be able to develop something for you, but they'll just create their own, or go to another organisation that creates a encrypted chat channel and won't abide by governments globally. And you all of a sudden you're just going to start playing whack-a-mole almost, with trying to play catch-up with this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems to me, John, the heart of the matter here is that you've got security agencies want to read messages they believe may be related to terror activities, but at the same time, need to maintain the overall integrity of the encrypted messaging services. It's a real balance to strike, isn't it, John?
Well, I think, that's exactly the point. And the problem is, if you build vulnerabilities or backdoors or call them whatever you want into these solutions, then that actually makes it very much less safe for all of us. And as Nigel quite rightly points out, a lot of this technology is actually open source. It's not, it's not something that I could do, but somebody with a bit of computer science experience can essentially go out and build their own end-to-end encryption system. So, cracking down on WhatsApp and the popular ones, in a sense, will just drive malicious users elsewhere, and essentially then leave the rest of us, sort of, as it were, law-abiding people, less safe than we otherwise might be. So I think it's important, to remember, again, as Nigel sort of mentioned at the start, there's a whole range of powers that our intelligence agencies and the police have, including the ability to, get on a device and essentially install, what could be called malware or spyware that essentially, will then read messages before they're encrypted, and then after they're encrypted, coming back the other way. So, that's very targeted, as Nigel said. They need to go and get a warrant to do that, and that's all very, very appropriate. But this idea that somehow, because encryption, therefore terrorism, it's just really not that simple. And I think we need to be really, really wary when we hear the sorts of things that Theresa May particularly has come out and said. We just have to regulate the internet. I mean, that's a profoundly ignorant and profoundly dangerous.
Yeah, we talked about the backdoor option of breaking encryption, but Jacinta, is there a front door option?
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. I think if we can compare that, the comments of Theresa May and also the way the UK has approached this, and also New Zealand, where they've legislated already on enforcing that ability to access information. That's one way of doing it. Australia will no doubt update our telecommunications legislation at some stage, but right now, a very important message coming from that Five Eyes meeting of Attorneys General that George Brandis spoke about just in the last few days, is that this is about cooperation. This isn't about governments saying you can't do this and you can't do that, because it's recognising that the internet itself in general, the telecommunications connectivity we have, and encrypted solutions are by and large a great enabler for society. So the issue here is, how do we work as communities, as businesses, including the telcos, with governments, law enforcement, to create an environment that's just more hardened to criminal use and more hardened to terrorist extremists. And you mentioned the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism set up by those 4 major companies. That's a really good indication of the type of things that the companies are now stepping up to try to do. They didn't set up Facebook or Messenger or YouTube in order to facilitate criminal activity, but criminals, of course, as John and Nigel have pointed out, have used these. They've taken advantage of them. But again, as the companies become aware of that, they've tried to do things and they're stepping up their activity as well. So I think we need to focus on that principle, trying to minimise criminal ease of use, try to minimise access of their messages and propaganda and so on, but not being able to get rid of it, because as Nigel correctly pointed out, you can't get rid of it entirely, but do something that's just a bit better, making sure that there's not a situation where a 15-year-old can easily just get onto WhatsApp and talk to a terrorist in the Middle East, as happened in Australia in relation to the Anzac Day plots, is perhaps part of it, but more importantly, how did that 15-year-old become aware of the Australian? How were they involved in that open environment, communicating with them before they got to encryption? And that's sort of the open door element. How do we minimise that impact? And also perhaps look at some protocols. I think that's something that these companies will look at. What are the protocols for accessing this type of encrypted communication? But the answer is certainly looking forward to some innovative solutions, not just looking at how we might be able to apply the old controls under the old types of laws to the new technology, because it just doesn't fit.
Yeah, well, let's listen to something that happened that took place on RN Breakfast straight after that Five Eyes meeting in Canada. Here's the Attorney General, George Brandis. He ruled out that backdoor option of breaking encryption. This is what he said, that the government will be asking of service providers.
What we need is to develop, and what we'll be asking the device makers and the ISPs to agree to, is a series of protocols as to the circumstances in which they will be able to provide voluntary assistance to law enforcement. There is also, of course, the capacity which exists now in the United Kingdom and in New Zealand under their legislation for coercive powers, but we don't want to resort to that. We do not want to resort to that. We want to engage with the private sector to achieve a set of voluntary solutions.
Now, Nigel.
Okay, we're on the upload limit. Back immediately.